When does tourism become exploitation, and how do we balance the desires of tourists with the comfort, safety, well-being and rights of local and Indigenous people? Tourists often don't mean to cause harm, but sometimes their desire for luxury, unique and incredible experiences can create a problematic demand that's usually filled by greedy, rich international corporations, sometimes at the expense of local people, wildlife or natural environments. That's exactly what happened in the case of the Marriott Ritz-Carlton Hotel that was built in the Maasai Mara by Lazizi Limited, despite a moratorium on new tourist lodge developments, which had been in place in the Maasai Mara since 2023. A moratorium is a temporary suspension imposed by the government, and the idea was to allow the Maasai Mara, a heavily touristed area that has been feeling some effects of over-tourism, to recover. The hotel has caused extreme controversy, fueled by social media and led by the Maasai communities in the area, who say the hotel has been illegally built on an important wildlife corridor without their free, prior and informed consent. Many are asking, why was this hotel allowed to be built despite governmental restrictions? What impact will this have on the wildlife? What issues will it cause for the surrounding communities? And is there anything we can do to fight this? I'm Emma, host of the Sustainable Travel Podcast, and this week I interviewed conservationist Janna Giacoppo, director of the One But Many documentary and founder of the Human Wildlife Project, about this lodge.
I'm Janna Giacoppo, and I'm based in the US, but I've spent the last 9 years, going on 9 years, working on a documentary. It's called One But Many. It's about human wildlife conflict and its impact on not just the wildlife, but also, humans and the threat that it poses to livelihoods, life, also to, endangered species. And I started this almost 9 years ago. We focused kind of on Kenya, actually. So it's interesting that we're looking at this lodge in the Maasai Mara because I've spent a lot of time in the Mara. And Kenya is known for its, kind of great community conservation initiatives. And that was something that really drew me to kind of basing the film in Kenya. And they have a lot of human wildlife conflict as well. So there's a lot to look at there. But I went to film school way back in the beginning and didn't end up making films. I produced a few things, but I worked mostly as a freelance photographer. That's been my main bread and butter. And when I was in Kenya almost 10 years ago, I was there for something for photographic work, but was learning about how big of a problem human wildlife conflict is in Kenya and how, it's such an underreported issue.
Human wildlife conflict is a term used to describe any situation where animals and humans interact negatively, and it happens all over the world. In places like Kenya, this can be as severe as a herd of elephants wiping out a farmer's annual crop in one night, but it can also be standalone cases such as individuals coming across wildlife in urban areas and being injured or killed. It doesn't usually happen out of nowhere. Though wildlife and humans have coexisted peacefully for years, the prolific development of infrastructure in recent years, climate change and expanding human populations have led to shrinking habitats and competition for food and water. It can also come about through direct human interference such as feeding wildlife. For example, in places like Bali and India, animals such as monkeys can become a menace to society when they are fed by communities or tourists, and it can be very hard to regain control of the situation. No one wins in human-wildlife conflict zones. Both sides can be killed or injured, and people can lose livelihoods.
And in, say, the States, we have coyotes coming into people's yards. People see them on walks with their dogs, and people are not taught or educated, rather, on what are the behaviors of even a coyote. People are afraid of them and they want to have them shot versus realizing, oh, we've built on their land. They have less food, less water. How do we now coexist as we have grown as human population? Wildlife has shrunk, land has shrunk, in terms of land available for wildlife. And I think in my opinion, it's the most important topic in conservation right now is human wildlife conflict, and how do we coexist peacefully with wildlife going forward in this landscape. It's sadly, I think, a prolific issue that just doesn't get the attention that this case is getting because the Mara is such a popular, well-known, spot.
Yeah, and I think, it's been a long road coming up to this, but the displacement of communities in East Africa in particular, I think, has slowly been amping up to such a degree that people are starting to get quite angry about it. There's been heavily publicized protests from other Maasai down in Loliondo region in Tanzania as well, which a lot of my listeners know I have a huge connection with Tanzania. I have family there. And it's, I think, just come at the right time that everything has come together to put the spotlight on this lodge in particular. The building of the Ritz-Carlton Marriott Lodge calls human rights into question as well as animal welfare. Community displacement in East Africa in the name of conservation has been a huge issue now for the last century and perhaps even longer. The group currently most affected in Tanzania are the Maasai, who were pushed out of the Serengeti years ago by colonial conservation policies and are now being pressured to leave Ngorongoro Conservation Area and the Loliondo region against their will. The Tanzanian government has increasingly restricted Maasai access to their ancestral lands, despite granting rights to safari companies and even previously a UAE-owned hunting concession. Tanzania isn't the only country affected. In Uganda, the Batwa people were famously evicted from Bwindi National Park when it was created in the 90s in the name of conserving the mountain gorillas in the area. And in Kenya, Sengwer tribes have been repeatedly evicted from Mbambut and Mau Forest in the name of forest protection. All of these displacements have since been heavily criticised by human rights organisations, and many have been ruled unlawful. It would be one thing if these displacements actually helped conservation, but evidence suggests they do not. These communities largely live peacefully with their wildlife. Many have done so as sustainable pastoralists for centuries, and in some cases, displaced land is later used for tourism, trophy hunting, or other commercial ventures. Conservationists call this fortress conservation, an outdated idea that people and wildlife just simply do not go together. It disproportionately affects indigenous groups, and displacements frequently occur with limited consultation amid protests with inadequate compensation. Removing people by force or pressure creates conflict and is likely to lead to resentment for the wildlife in communities that previously coexisted without issue, and ultimately to human-wildlife conflict. Yeah, I've been seeing, I first came across you because I saw your videos kind of speaking out about it, and you were one of the first people I saw really speaking in a lot of detail, but not just making this like inflammatory content about it. It was really like informationally focused. This is what I've been seeing happening. It's a shocking situation, honestly, it really is.
It is shocking. I think, I don't know how much you want to intro about the situation, but, the topic of community land and land rights, in this case, in the Masai Mara, is, I think, such a prescient topic globally because we're encountering so much new development. And, if laws can be bent, or in this case, there was a moratorium on building in the Mara, if there can be, in this case, a presidential exception, just looking at what precedent that sets for other indigenous land, rights situations, conservation law, et cetera. So I think it's inflamed a lot of people because it's very upsetting, but it also kind of opens up a conversation that I think is an important global conversation.
Yeah, it's an eye-opening and groundbreaking case, I would say. And I'm really happy that we're going to be covering it. I think it's such an important thing to get stuck into. So in the case of the Marriott Ritz-Carlton Lodge, the people who began speaking up first were the Kenyan Maasai, led initially by Maasai elder Dr. Meitaime Ololdapash, which is notable because the Maasai have previously encouraged tourism in this region.
But Kenya, because they banned trophy hunting in 77, they banned it because there was a poaching crisis of elephant and rhino. And so they banned trophy hunting. And then so all of these kind of, it's almost like necessity is the mother of invention. They found ways to be sustainable, and photo tourism really took off. And so they've created this beautiful culture of non-consumptive tourism and have found ways to live, in this community conservation model, which in my opinion is the path forward. But that I think brings us to the Maasai situation because they're living in a community conservation model where they are benefiting from the wildlife tourism to some extent. But so when you see local people saying, we don't want this lodge,
yeah.
meaning we don't need this business because it's going to do damage to the ecosystem, that is telling you something because those are people who would be potentially financially profiting from that. So if they don't want it, that's something to be paid attention to. Never mind the fact that it's their land to make that decision as well.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, you're quite right. It does bring us really neatly into the whole Masai Mara, Marriott, Ritz-Carlton, Lazizi Limited situation. So Can we talk a little bit about what has happened here, what is still happening? And it's obviously a very fast-paced, fast-moving situation. We're going to try and get this podcast out as soon as possible, but if we can, like, where are we at with it now?
Sure. And just to state the obvious, so since I am not there and haven't had the opportunity to go to the court, different court dates, I've just been, again, asking different contacts that I have in Kenya in conservation. And from my understanding, what happened was there was a moratorium on building any new tourism lodges, any new developments in the Masai Mara. I think until 2032, I believe. I think it was 2023. It extends for about 10 years. And the Marriott Ritz-Carlton built a luxury safari lodge right in the middle of the Mara in an area that was designated as part of this moratorium. And the reason the moratorium was put in place was because there was concern over too much development, and what that can look like are, you start to see the ecosystem suffering, and there's different ways you could measure that. One of the obvious ways that you would see is that you see very stressed animals. You'll see stressed cats, stressed elephants, and when that happens, they can actually stop breeding. So if you're concerned about maintaining a cheetah population, which is probably the biggest concern of the cats in terms of who is the closest to extinction, cheetah are very tough to kind of keep the population healthy, especially in a crowded ecosystem. Because, for example, with cheetah, the other cats are going to push them out, right? So leopards will go for a cheetah, lions will want to push cheetah out. So they have to have some space that, they can breed safely, get food, etc. So as the spaces get smaller and smaller, you have less room for all these animals. Mm-hmm. And so every time you put in a lodge, you disrupt their migration pattern, you disrupt like things that they say, once you have disrupted an ecosystem, you can't put it back, or a migration route. Animals won't return the same way.
In the case of the Marriott Ritz-Carlton Lodge, the people who began speaking at first were the Kenyan Maasai, led initially by Maasai elder Dr. Maitaime Ololdapash, which is notable because the Maasai have previously encouraged tourism in the region.
There was obviously concern that this area was sort of overdeveloped. And if anyone's been to the Mara, you'll see there's a lot going on. Like, yeah. I've had vastly different experiences depending on which camps I've been to. I've been to ones where, it's very small. The footprint seems small. It's community led. They're very careful about where they're driving, how close they're getting to the animals. And then I've had others, I won't name names, but I've had others where they're speeding up to sleeping lions and lion cubs and thinking I'm the photographer, filmmaker, I want to get that close. Yeah. And they're like all but driving on top of them. And then there's just vehicle. And it begins to look like a zoo, and so the Mara, for my opinion, definitely warranted a moratorium on building. And so somehow Marriott Ritz-Carlton, through Lazizi Mara Limited, they were the actual builders and owners. The president of Kenya made a presidential exception, so granted this lease of land, and that is the problem, because it potentially, there's so many problems with that, but we could talk about that. But yeah, so he granted an exception. They built the lodge. I think that's what was confusing to a lot of people, even myself at the beginning, was that this lodge was already built and operating. Mm-hmm. When Dr. Dapash, he filed a lawsuit. He's a Maasai community elder who's been a longtime conservation leader and advocate for the area, filed a lawsuit against Lazizi Mara, against Marriott Ritz-Carlton. And that was in the summer, I believe, August of 2025. And that's when it kind of started to gain some traction. And I started to see some things about that afterwards. And really, just kind of tried to throw myself in to find out as much as I could. And I ended up creating a change.org petition, which was simply because someone I follow was kind of posting about it and giving some good updates. And someone in the comments said, is there a petition? There should be a petition. And so I was like, there's no petition. And I just at 1:00 in the morning made a petition and just said, here's a petition. Just simply, I'm a huge believer of petitions, by the way. I love them. I think it's, it's such a simple way to help make a difference. And people think, oh, what could that signature do? Well, when you get enough of them, it now signals public awareness. That's public pressure. That triggers potentially, larger journalists, or mainstream, media to cover it. Potentially puts pressure on government entities, et cetera. So it's hugely important. So that's kind of how that happened. I didn't have any. I think it's got a lot of signatures now, but it then triggered. Dr. DePache had reached out to me. And basically he reached out through an email and just said he was hoping someone would start a petition on change.org, and found the one that we started.
Though Dr. DePache and many other Kenyan Maasai were at the forefront of the case against Marriott, Ritz-Carlton and Lazizi Limited, he has since dropped the case. This is after reports of a gag order being placed upon him by the hotel owners, and seems to have been a result of mounting pressure against him. Though Janna has been in touch with Dr. DePache, it is important to add at this point that contact between them has been informal, and the only time that they have spoken directly about the case was about the petition Janna set up several months ago. The Kenyan court has since blocked the attempt to withdraw the lawsuit because there is mounting public interest in the case.
But the Kenyan court decided that this would be continued. They would continue to investigate this case because it was a matter of public interest based on wildlife and indigenous, concerns. So the case is being continued through the court. It's being represented by, sort of the legal entity in Kenya, sort of advocating for wildlife, saying that the environmental assessment that needs to be done on a land before you build, to say, is this land able to sustain this new development, that was not transparent. The report was either rushed or maybe not really done properly because, again, this land was a part of a moratorium. That, to me, but the biggest concern, the wildlife piece is clearly of gigantic concern. But the piece that concerns me, I think, the most from a human rights perspective is that the indigenous community is supposed to have a say. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to say if we approve this or not. And there were community members that did come out. We haven't heard from them since, I think, the New York Times article that said, I didn't vote for this, but my name was on a petition.
The Maasai are widely recognised as the caretakers of the Maasai Mara ecosystem, and the breach of the moratorium on the Mara should not legally have happened without their free, prior and informed consent, meaning they consented the project going forward of their own free will and knowing exactly what it would entail. The New York Times reported, however, that at least one of the Maasai elders in the surrounding area, Julius Manchau Liaram, claimed that his signature had been forged to approve the project. Mr. Liaram says he never attended the meeting where his signature was apparently given, and that he would never have approved the project if he had attended. He has since filed a police report and feels that whoever forged his signature thought he would never know it had been done, on the incorrect assumption that the Maasai are ignorant of these kind of things and won't stand up for themselves. So that's kind of where we stand right now, is we're just waiting for the outcome because the case has been held open because of so much public interest, which I think also in part, Janna, is because of petitions that were started and the information that was put on social media. So hugely thanks to you and other people who shared about it as well. Like, it's so important in cases like this not to think, well, I'm just one person, I can't do anything. We really all need to work together on things like this.
I couldn't not agree more about that. It's the concept that what can I do? What can one person do? Is sort of at the, I did go to film school, so I have that, but I did not actually plan on doing documentary. I never thought I would do that. I made this film because I wanted to try to shed light on an issue, open up a conversation, inspire people to speak out, take action, etc. And, I'm just one person, and you never know where one story can reach, where one signature can go. So I kind of have lived my life on this belief that one person, it can definitely make a difference. And when we all come together, wow, you can really have great change. But just to speak to your point about this lodge was built and no one in mainstream media was speaking about it, and why all of a sudden did it get coverage. I think that's inherently sort of shows the problem with mainstream media, unfortunately, that they're only going to, there's so much going on. They're going to cover things that are becoming a global topical conversation. So this was happening. Obviously, it wasn't getting enough traction somewhere that it was reaching New York Times and Washington Post and Reuters, which are now covering it. And it was when social media started showing it, and gaining a more global audience. And I think while, I personally try to walk a very fine line of not speaking for local people, and yet, sometimes if you're amplifying that conversation with now, it's just adding to how many people are seeing and hearing about it. And then perhaps it can push it to a point where, oh, now Reuters is going to cover it. Now New York Times is going to cover it. So I think it kind of like invites the question of, as non-locals or non-Africans, if we're speaking to, say, in this case, an African issue, like what's the most ethical way? Because you have an ethical travel podcast, right? Like, even what's the ethical way of reporting this? Like, should we report it? And I would say, I think yes. I think we should, because I think it's a way to help. But what's that line? What's the line between doing it from a responsible, respectful way and maybe overstepping?
I think ultimately, when you talk about amplifying voices, you hit the nail on the head. Like, we're not talking about this from a perspective of we came up with it and we are the people who are like in the know about this. It's like, we've heard about this thing, it deserves more attention, let's shine a spotlight on it. And also, if we are able to, if they're not going to be at risk, let's name the people who are talking about it, give them the credit. And yeah, that's I think that is the best way, in my opinion. What was frustrating for the Maasai in the case of the Marriott Ritz-Carlton Lodge is that although they had been speaking out about it since the hotel was first commissioned, the case only began to gain international press in August 2025, when the hotel was mere months away from being built, meaning essentially a lot of the damage had already been done and it was going to be difficult to stop the hotel's construction. A lot of the attention came from social media, and it was only when it began to gain traction online that the international press began reporting on it. We were saying about why it didn't get as much press early on, but there is that question of like, how was it allowed to be built in the first place? Now, I'm not expecting you to have the answers on this, or even like, we don't even necessarily need to conjecture, but I think we can say like Lazizi Limited are the ones who got the permission to do this, and that had to come in some way from the Kenyan government. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, and from my understanding, it was a clear decision, an exception made by the Office of the President. So that's what I've read repeatedly. So I do believe that's factual, that it was a presidential exception to let them build where there had been a moratorium. And obviously that's bad for many reasons, but also I think one of the concerns that conservationists are having, not just like on a like micro, this particular wildlife corridor being impacted, the people being impacted, but what is this signal to conservation globally or in other parts of Africa or the world, where if there is a moratorium and it can be bypassed, then it signals that this is, these laws or, protections are really just, they're really like a temporary measure until somebody can come along with enough money.
I agree with you. Do we think there is any world in which this particular hotel had found an area of this corridor, this area that was unimpacted, that wouldn't be a problem for wildlife, or is that there's just simply no way, it must be a financial transaction?
Um, I would say it's highly unlikely, and the reason I would use as the reason I would say that is that if they had deemed this area not impacted, the wildlife migration would not be impacted, that would likely mean they had done a very thorough environmental impact assessment to say, this is why we think this land should be exempt. And from what I continue to read and hear is that there was not a comprehensive EIA done. And so they are not saying, look, here's all the evidence of why we should have a moratorium. because it's not going to be impacted. In fact, videos and reports come showing wildebeest and animals trying to cross and
Mm.
running into the lodge. And again, if you've been in the Mara during the migration, you know how many animals are moving, so the argument that, oh, it's just one area, even if they are impacting them, it's just one area, they can go other places. That's an ignorant way to look at wildlife migration and how they are. Because what happens is when they have a route, if there's a road you're driving to work and you've got 10 minutes to get there and you have a detour, we all know that confuses us. We're like
Mm.
stressed. Oh, I'm going to be late now. You're going down one road, you run into a road and you're doing a fast U-turn. It causes chaos,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the same thing for wildlife. And what that equals often is more wildlife and human conflict because now they might end up in farms, they might end up in villages, they might end up on roads that they normally would not have ended up on.
Mm.
That you're creating this whole cascade effect. Never mind that immediate, like, did they get injured or die from trying to cross and they couldn't, you know, but it's also what signals, sort of like, oh, you can potentially get around a moratorium without a comprehensive environmental impact assessment done. And the reason I don't think it was done was that I keep reading that it has not been done. And if it had been, I believe these are the documents that we would see. You go, stop coming after us. Look at this. Yes, we violated the moratorium, but we were absolutely diligent that it's not going to affect the wildlife. So do I think it was just a money grab? 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And I mean, you've sort of answered the next question I was going to ask, but I think this is really important to expand on. There's like so much we could say here. Is you were talking earlier about cheetahs, and again, like I'm not as much of the expert as you by any means. I'm more of the kind that's very interested in this topic and do a lot of reading, but it's not something that I've ever studied. So I was seeing as well, and maybe you can speak to this, that it's very difficult to breed cheetahs in captivity, even without competition from other species, because they are like highly territorial themselves, the males. And also they need these wide areas to roam, like you were saying, where if they, they might not come into contact with another female for several months, several years, whatever. But when they do, that's like their opportunity. So if you're kind of keeping them, again, separate or dividing this
Mhm.
big area, it
Yep.
creates the same effect as if they were in captivity, right?
Actually a great way to look at it. And because it's like, let's say you put the lodge right in the middle of an area that had been protected.
Mm.
You are displacing more than just the migratory, wildebeest and other animals coming through this migration, right? Like you don't know what pride of lions you might have just impacted. And now they've moved. And now maybe then the cheetah, now they're closer to where a cheetah had been. And now that cheetah's in a farm. Now that cheetah's in a village. Now that cheetah's in a road. The impacts are just so far reaching.
Mm.
And conservationists and ecological experts know this. And that's why there are such serious protections. But in the case of the cheetah, they don't breed well in captivity, which is kind of a widely known fact. And it is in part, like you're saying, because of territory. It's also what they have found. I mean, it's tough to get animals to breed in captivity in general. And people will speculate that it's because it's not their natural environment.
Mm.
And they almost have it's almost like a survival protection in a weird way where they're not going to propagate their own species when their environment doesn't sustain their thriving and their health,
Mm.
right? So it's almost like, would you have a baby if you were kidnapped and held in a basement? Your body would be so stressed that like you might not get pregnant as easily. You might not carry the baby to term as easily. It's similar to that, the level of stress that we're putting on them. So I think, you know, in this case, we have to think about how much stress is being put on these animals that are very important to Kenya, to
Mm.
their tourism model, very important to the Maasai's livelihoods, right? Very important to the world, conservation animal lovers don't want these animals to go extinct. And in cheetah, there's less than 6,000 left in the world.
Yeah.
We started out with 100,000. That's the number, say, before colonization, before people came in and started shooting them.
Yeah.
So less than 6,000. And cheetah Kenya is one of the last territories for cheetah.
Yeah.
You've got some in Tanzania, you've got Namibia, and then, you see them in South Africa, you see them, but like Kenya is more of a stronghold. It's like the really only stronghold of East Africa. And so to throw a lodge in the middle of the Mara, you're going to affect cheetah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we talk about human wildlife conflict as well, we often focus on sort of the effect that the wildlife is having on the humans.
Mhm.
But if you look at it in this case, it's like this is human wildlife conflict that we've brought to their door. Like we've literally gone in, invaded their territory, put in, and it's a very intersectional issue because, as you said very early on in the podcast, tourism is something that ultimately benefits a lot of the Maasai communities in the Mara because of the community tourism models they have in place. So if they're saying we do not want this, that is an issue to be taken very, very seriously.
Very much so. I mean, if you come to me and offer me money and I say no, there's got to be a good reason. Because why wouldn't I want more money? You know what I'm saying? Why would they not want more money? So there's a very good reason that Dr. Tapash and other Maasai, elders and community members went to court for this, and why they withdrew, we can only speculate. They certainly haven't told us,
Yeah.
but why else would I withdraw something that serious that cost me that much time and money and stress and pressure, other than I'm being threatened with either a lawsuit that I can't possibly compete with their lawyers and their money and their power, or I'm being threatened additionally beyond that, and this isn't, we'd be naive to say, oh, that would never happen. It's kind of the way it's done, you know,
Yeah.
and, and we're not, again, we're speculating, but that's just based on a history of how, big entities, this is obviously connecting to another global conversation right now, which is, the world being at the mercy of billionaires and of
Yes.
greed and of oligarchs and of big business, and how it doesn't seem like there's an end to this out of control, greed, which potentially is at the heart of how this lodge was allowed to be built.
Yeah. I mean, I think realistically, anybody looking at this case would assess it and from a public perspective and say, well, there's probably some element of threatening going on there, of public pressure at the very least. There's something going on. And like you said, we are speculating, we cannot say. But even if it's none of those things, I do think we need to ask, like, why did he start in the first place? Because it's a huge undertaking for Dr. Depache, for other Maasai elders in the area. Like, it's not something they would go into lightly when they're already doing important work in conservation. So I completely agree. And I also want to talk about, so free, prior, and informed consent is obviously the term that we use when we're talking about kind of doing things on land that belongs to Indigenous people, that belongs to yeah, to Indigenous people. And this was seemingly done without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Maasai. And it was something that now seems to have come to light, has been done through forged consent potentially. Um, can we talk about like why it matters so much that you need to get consent from the Maasai before doing something like this? I know you touched on it a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And that is, I know, basically what other people that might have researched this would know, that the New York Times reported that there were Maasai that said their name was forged, and that was part of why they were protesting this. So if one person or two people come forward, how many people didn't come forward? Because it's actually, like you said, it's not easy for them to go and contest this. It's actually, from my understanding too, it's not as in their culture. Like maybe in the Maasai, different than say in a remote region of Zambia where they really have no resources to get to government and contest something. But that's not how they're usually doing things. So for them to take it to court is again a huge statement. And I think, why would it be so important to get indigenous people's consent to build on their land? I mean, this is like, to me, this is as foundational as anything in conservation. Conservation isn't and shouldn't be considered just conserving animals, right? It shouldn't just be the wildlife, even though I'm the biggest animal lover and it's my greatest passion. Without healthy community and participation from community, we will not have healthy wildlife. We
Yeah.
will lose species like cheetah, like elephant. You go down the list. So if you care about wildlife, you have to care about the people living with the wildlife, full stop. But I also care about the people, obviously. So to speak to that, it's when you're conserving wildlife, and in Africa, they were trying to repair the fact that colonization had come in and just taken the land, just like the United States was built on stolen land. They stole the land. They started trophy hunting and shooting everything and building roads and railways. And, that was such a terrible thing that happened that when they started to do these repairs, they gave land back to indigenous populations. Just like in the US, things have been given back and violated repeatedly. But I think what that signals, if you give that land back and say, these are the reparations, this is your land, you get to decide what happens on it, and then you violate that, you basically say this is all a show. This is all a show. That we're just doing this to appease you and to look good. Because if your consent doesn't matter at some point, you're just going right back to the original model, except now you have potentially your own government doing it to you versus, an outsider invading and deciding what's going to happen. Now the government is participating in your own loss of rights. In Tanzania, you've mentioned Tanzania, how they have been displacing Maasai for trophy hunting land. And this has been going on for years. And they've done petitions, and the president has been called out. She said she wasn't going to do this when she got elected, and then she did. And I have video upon video upon video footage of people being like versions of little bombs being thrown at them, shot, and moved violently off their land to make more room for trophy hunting.
Yeah.
And trophy hunting now makes up 26% of Tanzania's landmass. And so, these were people that had rights to their land as well. And so it just signals, I think, that it's such a slippery slope that when you do it, once you do it once, you make that exception, you signal that you as a local person actually have no rights to your land. So what else do you not have rights to? And I don't know that there's anything more damaging than that message being sent to indigenous communities that have already been through so much historically. I think it's kind of the worst of the worst things that you could do to them.
I think it must feel so threatening. Like it must feel so scary. It's like, we talk about colonization, and I even got like a comment the other day saying, "You're so obsessed with colonization." And I'm like, well, when it ends, I'll stop talking about it. It's not over when you consider this kind of behavior, because this is colonization. An outsider saying, I have the money and I am going to pay someone so that I can decide what happens with your land. That is a tactic of colonization, and I just don't accept it.
No, you're 100% correct. This is colonization, and the reason it should be continued to be discussed and named is because it has not ended. I think and sadly, it's so sad how things can be twisted now so easily with fake news or AI and people not knowing what to believe and, propaganda. Like it's obviously all that stuff propaganda was always going on, but now the ability to get propaganda to the masses is so much easier and faster than having to fly a plane and drop pamphlets or something, to communities. But sometimes the people who are doing the colonizing will turn around and say the people advocating for indigenous rights or, fair practices are behaving like colonizers. It's a crazy and then it just confuses everybody. So I think naming it what it is important because it's signaling that no, we haven't solved this yet, and maybe there will never be a day where people aren't trying to take away somebody else's rights and land because of back to greed and power and special interests. I know, Kenya banned hunting in 77, but I always hear people in conservation there saying there's always groups trying to push it, trying to change it, trying to get exceptions, so maybe it's always going to be unfortunately, a battle for people's rights and wildlife rights, frankly.
Yeah, which is so intertwined as well. I mean, in this case, what would you recommend for someone who wants to help? I mean, obviously, we're hoping that it's going to be resolved or coming to an end in sort of the near future, but it's a great kind of benchmark of what these cases mean for wildlife, what they mean for humans, for indigenous communities. So is there anything people can do, I guess, two-part question, for this particular case? And moving forward, what should we be doing with this kind of when this sort of thing happens?
I think that's a great question because, again, especially when you're far away and there's so much going on, it's so easy to just be like, well, what can I possibly do? Like, I can't do anything. I personally, again, believe in sharing information. So I think if someone is interested in what's going on there and in this topic, you know, just reading up as much as you can, trying to research because you'll start to see a through line and you'll start to assimilate that information more and you'll go, okay, this is what's happening. And so then when you speak to somebody, you speak to them with a little bit more confidence even.
Yeah.
And then okay, I want to share this. I'm a big, again, believer, share it to stories, share it in text messages,
Yeah.
share petitions and also, writing emails. Like I know that people have been saying, write emails to the Marriott, write emails to, the Ritz-Carlton. I'm not against any of that. I think if you have the energy to do that, boycotts work great. No one's boycotted Marriott yet. I don't know if or when that will come, but we've seen the public pressure with, I believe it was when Jimmy Kimmel was fired. Everybody dropped Hulu and Paramount, and within 2 days he was back to work,
Yeah.
because of public pressure and because of money. So I think the first thing I would always say is that if someone cares, just start like being curious about it and start searching for, the latest article or post and just start to weed through and see what you respond to and then start following those creators or those people. The Maasai land rights group on Instagram is, I feel like, a really great one if people want to kind of follow this case because they're sharing things in as much in real time as we're able to get things. And then I think once you follow them, you'll start seeing other creators pop up that are reporting from East Africa. Like I'm following a bunch of people who are reporting about this in Africa, in Kenya mostly, and they're kind of saying the same things. They're all so you'll start to see a through line in what's being said, but I'd say, like following these accounts, sharing information, and encouraging people to share, encouraging like friends to share. I think it does way more again than we would think it does. Back to that, like, why did this all of a sudden gain traction? Well, it started to get more and more attention on social media.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think for me, my actionable points would be, I mean, I do boycott Marriott. They are such a big name brand. They're probably the biggest brand in the hotel industry. And I think people don't realize that if you boycott them, if you stop booking with them, especially if you have loyalty points. Like I saw somebody in my comments who said he just made such a throwaway comment, like they tagged Hilton and they were like, "Hey Hilton, can I transfer all my Marriott points over to you?" And like, I'm sure they're actually not going to do that, but it's just such a great little like nudge to Marriott.
100%. I mean, this not that there would be a global boycott of Marriott based on this. And again, it's connected to the, Lazizi Limited, et cetera. But personally, I would love to see someone do that. I would be on it in a second.
Yeah, I mean, and we should say as well to anybody who doesn't think this is about money, that Marriott Lodge is currently selling at $3,000 US dollars per night for a lead-in category room, so the entry level. This is 100% about money.
Oh,
But I will just finish up by saying my other points, my other actionable ways that you can help. So sign Janna's petition. And also, yeah, just read about it, share about it. Like if you see something like this and you think, hey, this is interesting, you don't need to share it as an authority. You can just say, hey, has anybody seen this? Like put it on your story,
yep.
like this interested me. I think we worry sometimes too much about, I don't want to share something and have it be incorrect or the wrong thing. Like send it to a friend or just, yeah, pop it on a close friend story or something like that. And that's kind of all I would say. The case of the Marriott Ritz-Carlton Lodge is not isolated. This one may have gained more traction than the others, but these kinds of violations of Indigenous land rights, community displacements, and damage to important ecosystems happen world over, almost always as an attempt from an already wealthy corporation to exploit Indigenous people and nature for more money. As a collective, we have more power than they do. We must not accept when companies do this. You can sign Janna's petition in her Instagram bio. Her handle is Janna Giacoppo, all one word, also linked in the Spotify and YouTube descriptions of this podcast. You can also find out more about her work, the One But Many documentary, on onebutmanydocumentary.com, which looks at the worldwide impact of human-wildlife conflict, how it's being ignored and weaponized for trophy hunting, which can make wildlife more aggressive and fuels extinction. You can sign up for email alerts to stay if it will screen near you. This has been the Sustainable Travel Podcast. You can find news of upcoming episodes on Instagram at the Sustainable Travel Podcast, or subscribe to our Spotify and YouTube channels wherever you're listening to this. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating. This helps other people find the show and gives us feedback on how we're doing.